Hey everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. Today, my guest is a writer, director, producer, actor, and educator of the youth of tomorrow. I am very excited to have her on the show because she is also a good personal friend of mine. You may have heard her in some of the other work that I have done, such as His Royal Fake Highness as the interminable Rosie. So, with all of that being said, please welcome my friend, Mary Frances Noser, to the show.
Hi guys, I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, this has been so good.
I'm excited also because the topic that we are choosing is one that I have to some degree been avoiding, I would say, and also is one that in my avoidance, some of the listeners of the show asked when we were going to do it because of how we handled Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they were hoping we would have a similar conversation. And so when you said that this is what the topic that you wanted to do, I thought, okay, I guess I wanted to do this topic with someone that I trust. I have like a good balance of sort of understanding their values, that our values are sort of aligned, and being able to have this conversation in a nuanced way. So I'm excited to be able to go through it because I do think it's a big one. So now that I've given the lead up of all lead ups, would you like to tell everyone what we are talking about today, what the piece of media that changed your life is?
So we're talking about Harry Potter, friends. It's like talking about Harry Potter is like talking about how I became an actor and how I became a writer and how I became a person who was able to deal with my dyslexia, like all together as one thing. I don't remember the first time I read the book. I don't remember the first time I saw the movie.
Okay.
It was sort of like, so for those of you who don't know, I'm heavily dyslexic and I went to an Ivy League preparatory school. So that means that I was like, all my friends were starting to read Junie B. Jones and like Magic Tree House in kindergarten. And like we're finishing those. Like my best friend would like go off in the corner with our teacher and she'd be like flying through Junie B. Jones at 6. I couldn't figure out what "the" meant.
Yeah.
Like I had no idea. But my parents read to me all the time. And like a lot of kids who fell into Harry Potter, we fell into it as we were learning to read. And so I don't remember, I think the first one was read to me at like 7.
Yeah, because the Harry Potter books for our age group, and I actually, one of the other reasons why I've been hesitant to cover Harry Potter is that it is something I don't really have any experience with growing up. I really did not read the books, and I didn't see any of the movies, and by the time I got to the point where I might have, everybody was already so into it that I was like, okay, I just am not gonna do it. I've only very recently become aware of like the plot.
Incredible.
I was like, I know there's magic.
There's a lot.
There's some wizardry.
Yeah.
Some witchery.
It's very gendered.
And some bad guys.
Yeah, there's some big time bad guys. There's some big time bad guys.
Yeah, so that was that, but I will say like that I do know how for our age group, our generation, those books really came out as you would be like kind of not only learning to read, but growing up and of similar age to the main characters as they were moving through. Slightly younger, I think.
I was about 5 to 6 years younger.
Yeah.
Because like the thing is, I'm one of 11 cousins on my mom's side.
Okay.
And so all my older cousins would be reading the books before me. And my cousin Jack also had a really hard time learning how to read. And so I have a very distinct memory of the 5th book coming out. I guess I was like 11, 12, somewhere in there. And like the fact that Jack was like, I need to go to the store and get this book to read was like, my family was ecstatic about. Shout out, Jack. You're so cool.
So you're one of 11 cousins.
One of 11 cousins on my mom's side.
And how many, you have siblings, but how many in your immediate family?
So there are 5 in my immediate family. I have 2 younger brothers.
2 younger brothers, okay. Yeah. So you are the oldest of 3.
I'm the oldest of 3. And so like watching, like Jack reading Harry Potter, he's 6 years older than me. Okay. And they were the ones who were really the same age as it came out. Because like when I was young, it was like Harry Potter was already out. Because I was 7 when the first movie came out. 2001, I was 6. And so like it was enough of a separation that you could like imagine yourself in those shoes. But it wasn't the same peer-to-peer experience of like, you're 11, I'm 11, you're 12, I'm 12. And we go through the thing. And I actually think that opens up a lot within the series. Because it became like, my friends and I'd be like, when are we going to get our letter? Like, we're 11, it's going to come, like, this is how I think it's going to come. Or like the letter would get delayed and we're like, oh, like it's just a middle school thing. Or like the letter would get delayed and we're like, oh, it's just a high school thing. Like we were there was definitely a period of time where my best friends and I were convinced that the letter was going to come.
Mm.
And like, then this is how it plays into how I learned how to be an actor, because we grew up in a neighborhood where we all were like, myself and my best friend across the street, Olivia, she has 2 younger brothers. And then my other best friend, she has 3 younger brothers. And we were all like a triangle.
Okay.
And so we would just sort of like knock around each other's houses between all 3 families. Can I do the math? 3 and 3 is 6 plus 4 is 10. That's 10 kids within like a
Oh my goodness.
like 3 blocks.
Yeah.
So we would just knock in between each other's houses. And my friend Maisie and I, we were obsessed with Harry Potter at the same time. And we created our whole fandom universe. Before I even knew what fan fiction was, before I even knew that that's what people did,
Yeah.
we came up with our own characters who we played the entire time. They had a whole back lore from the first book through the 5th that we came up with. Each book had our own version of what it was.
Yeah.
And every time we got together, we would play that version.
So before we get into kind of the deep lore of it, I do like to say, even with like the very popular stuff, when we talk about it, I like to ask the guests to say, like, if you were telling someone who had never heard of Harry Potter what it was about, what would you say Harry Potter was about?
Great question. Harry Potter is about a boy named Harry Potter who's an orphan who lives with his aunt and uncle who do not treat him well. And he grows up to feel unloved for the first 10 years of his life, and then suddenly gets a letter from this magical place called Hogwarts that says he's a wizard and that he belongs to this whole community where he has a very special place because he's the only one who's defeated this great, if I was telling this to children, Dark Lord, if I was telling this to adults, terrorist who came in and, terrorized this entire community. And he's the only one who's ever lived to tell the tale in a confrontation with this man. And it's the story of a person stepping into that role and trying to figure out what that means and the community and family that he builds as that goes along.
I think that's a good summary of it.
Thank you.
So you don't remember reading the book for the first time, but it sounds like your parents probably read you the first ones.
Yeah.
And then did you eventually transition into reading them on your own?
Yes.
Okay.
So the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, I had really intensive reading tutoring, like 4 to 5 times a week.
Okay.
And I went from being the worst reader in my entire grade to the best. Like literally I came back and my 2nd grade teachers, my parents talk about, like, they sat me down we had like these quarterly reports where we started taking sort of versions of standardized tests. And they were like, okay, here's her reading comprehension graph. She's off the graph. Like we don't have a space up here for how much she remembers.
Yeah.
It's unmeasurable for this age group.
Okay.
She's probably like reading at 5th, 6th grade level at 8.
Yeah.
And my parents were like, what the heck? She couldn't read last year.
Yeah.
And then they flipped to the math and they were like, okay, and she's on the bottom edge of this one. And my parents were like, okay, cool.
Great.
6.
She's still
Got it.
on the, at least she's still failing at something.
They were like,
what I mean?
Okay, cool. So maybe it's not dyslexia. Let's figure out what this is. We never did. It's fine. Not really, but we figured it out later. So all that to say, like, I don't remember reading the first one, but I got the second one for my 8th birthday.
Okay.
I still have like
The second copy.
the second copy. And that's when I started reading them on my own, like wildfire. Like I was Hermione for Halloween that summer. Like I made my own prefect badge that we have pictures of me in. I had the little robe that I still like kept through. So from 2nd grade onward, I just read them like wildfire. I had read up to the ones that had come out. I know when the 4th movie came out. Because I would read them on my own, and then also like Daddy would read them to me because he always read to me at night. And I have a very distinct memory of reading, like, we finished the 3rd book and we're like, oh, so excited to read the 4th one. And so we read the first chapter of the 4th one together. And the first chapter of the 4th one is like, holy shit, we're in a different series.
Yeah.
Like someone dies within the first chapter. It's a muggle. He's murdered in front of us.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh shit. Okay, this is Voldemort's here. This is what this is. And really, like, the horrors that people have been telling us about are now present. And so I remember reading that chapter and we finished it. And Daddy and I looked at each other and we're like, that was scary.
Yeah.
He was like, are you going to fall asleep? Like he was like, are you okay? Because I'm a very sensitive person, but I am still really sensitive to media. So my parents were always like, is this going to put pictures in your head that you're like unaware of? But books wouldn't do it nearly as much as movies would.
Sure.
And we like sort of sat there in that like, okay, this is something new.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I may have been 9 or 10 when I was reading the 4th one. I read pretty like dark stuff early.
Yeah, I was a big reader. I was having kind of like flashbacks to my own childhood as you were talking about your reading situation. I didn't have the issue of like having to learn, but I did have the like your child is reading so beyond far
Yep.
levels of normal.
Yeah.
Because we used to do like reading tests.
Yeah.
Where you have to like read the level book and prove that you can read it. Which
Yeah.
now looking back, I'm like, what a weird way to do that.
Yeah, it's I mean, the educator part of me that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah. No, it's also it's just like it's stressful for
Yeah.
kids for no reason.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Yep.
As a non-educator, but I've thought so much back to school and like the fact that I feel like I was just lucky in that I was having a conversation with someone I went to high school with actually the other day, and we were talking about a class that we took, which in my memory was one of my favorite classes. Because it was a history class that was lecture style and was done with a professor who was also teaching at UCLA. So it was like quite advanced. It was quite fast paced. He used a lot of like references. So he would like give a historical figure a nickname, but then never say that historical figure's name again. For me, it was really great. Like I really learned very well. I remember a lot of the information to this day from that class.
That's awesome.
And it was wonderful for me. But I was talking to the girl that I went to high school with, and she obviously has also grown up and had an adult life. And we were talking about that class, and I was speaking about it with fondness, and she was like, I dropped out of it after 3 weeks because there was no way I was going to pass. And was explaining sort of like, yeah, like I cannot learn that way.
Yeah.
And so I've now, since talking to a lot of girls that I went to high school with, or girls that I grew up with, or even or other people who are recounting their own education experience, I've realized how lucky I was that I just happened to learn the way that like traditional teaching is done.
Yep.
And how unfair it is that like we are aware that there are different learning styles, and we don't put it in the education system of trying to help each learning style learn properly.
Yeah.
We just teach one way and hope that people follow.
Especially if you're in public school. Like that's the way. And like literally the entire reason why I went to school I did and my brothers went to the school I did is because my parents looked at me and were like, she does not learn that way. And my dad has a master's in education. When I was a baby, he was a 9th grade English teacher. And so for a little bit, they were like, does dad homeschool me and then mom work full time? And I'm very grateful that my grandfather had a whole education monetary fund he'd set aside for his grandchildren. And so at the time, the public schools in Nashville did not have the intervention I needed.
Yeah.
And my mom went to a patchwork of lots of different schools, public, private, the whole 9 yards. And she was like, my kid is not having that happen, especially when we're pretty sure she has a learning disability. And so the public school at the time that I was zoned for did not have the intervention that I was going to need. And so they were like, okay, private's the way to go. And I got into a couple of schools, and the school that I ended up going to, USN, they had the intervention that I needed at that moment in time. And then because I got in, my brothers were able to get in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then like I was able to have the really intensive intervention that I needed, both reading wise and math wise, and also just like learning how to pick stuff up.
Yeah.
Because a lot of we're pretty sure I have dyscalculia. I've never been formally diagnosed with dyslexia, but it's like the shorthand that I give people because most people know what that is.
Yeah.
And I do have enough of the characteristics. I'm not going to call it symptoms because it's not an illness. It's just a different way of thinking.
Sure.
I have enough of those that like translating it to bosses or translating it to other friends or just, when I first meet people, especially professionally, they're like, okay, cool. I know what that is.
Yeah.
Dyscalculia, for those of you who are interested, is when you flip numbers and have a harder time with spatial awareness. And that's by far and away where mine shows up. Because I can't spell, which is where the dyslexia thing comes in, but I can read like crazy. So like, that's why it was like
they weren't sure about
they were
like
where
what
does this fit?
Yeah.
But then my math went like this and they're like, okay, well, that's definitely something.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons why I related to Harry Potter so much as a kid is because I've always had a really active imagination, but a lot of the book, especially the first ones, is feeling like the odd person out. And I was the only girl in these pull-out classes of all these boys who like none of us could read, none of us could like do this like spelling stuff, like none of us could figure out these math things, but we all were like trying to figure it out together. So I always felt singled out.
What's interesting about that, so I have since read the books. I borrowed them during quarantine because it was sort of one of those things where I was like, I would like to know. Like I have missed this boat, but it is something that obviously as someone who works in making content for teenagers often, like or for the teenage space, I suppose. It obviously has made a large impact. So it was one of those things where I was like, I need to understand the references and everything like that. So I borrowed the books from a friend who already had them from childhood. And the thing that is interesting about one of the things that you're talking about of kind of at the point where you're bringing those books into your life of sort of having a learning disability or learning in a different way and needing to work through that is something that I do remember from those books is that Harry is sort of, it's one of those chosen one narratives where the chosen one also seems to be bad at what they're learning how to do. Like he is certainly no star pupil as you're working through. And something that did strike me as well in that is as we're talking about sort of like teachers not teaching in different ways or teaching in a way that is helpful, is you do have these teachers who, as you're reading through, I do remember, especially because I didn't read them until I was an adult, looking at them and being like, these are bad teachers and they're not helpful.
Yeah.
And I think what it does is it creates this space where students feel stupid and therefore don't want to learn. Was that something that stuck out to you when you were reading the books, like as you were moving through that same space?
That's a great question. As a kid, I think I did pick up on the fact that some of these people were not teaching the way they need to be taught. And as someone who now has an education background, there are podcasts out there that have dived into this much deeper than I ever will. I have recommendations I can give you, literally episodes. But my favorite is Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which reads Harry Potter as a sacred text and using different sacred reading practices from Judaism and Christianity. And it has Harvard Divinity fellows or faculty who run the thing. And they have a whole segment that they call the failed pedagogy of Hogwarts, which is the failed way that teachers deal with and teach the students at Hogwarts. And it is not good. I would curse here, but we're on a podcast. But like,
you can curse.
Okay, it's fucked. It's completely, utterly, and totally fucked. I have tremendous issues with Dumbledore as a character, but specifically as a headmaster. I have a lot of issues with Snape as a teacher.
Yeah, Snape in particular, something the other thing about that schooling system, as we break down the problems of humanity about
well, this is what Harry Potter does, is all this stuff is wrapped up
in this story.
In this series and in this story. Because like in explaining Harry Potter to children, it's like this is a story about the evils of a bad guy. And explaining this to adults is this is the story of the evils of a society that has not addressed their inequities. They're just all exaggerated because Voldemort comes in.
And I think we'll get into sort of the irony of that when we talk about the author at a certain point, which we will be doing because I just don't think it's possible to talk about this without talking about that anymore.
No, it also wouldn't be ethical to do so.
Exactly, yeah. So those of you who are listening and are wondering, will we address the elephant in the room? We absolutely will be doing so. But I think one of the other things that really struck me, and it was because it reminded me of my own schooling days, was this point system that they have throughout the entire school where it's sort of become a joke, which was the only way I knew of it until I went through the books themselves. But this sort of like 50 points to or 50 points from Gryffindor over and over. And like this clearly biased system in which people are giving it. And when I don't know if you had this in, because it does feel like a very big private school thing, but we had like a merit. It was actually called a merit system, which was incorrect because it was a demerit. But I think they've since changed it if you go to my high school now. If you're listening. And if so, best wishes. I hope you're all right. We would get merit slips, even though they were demerit slips. And one teacher kept them on a bulletin board.
Oh my God.
So you could actually go and look at all of the slips that had been written for your grade level on a bulletin board. And I just remember, I thought it was such a dumb system because they also didn't do anything. They only affected your citizenship grade, which was not on your transcript for colleges. And so it was quite honestly like this weird system where it was like you were aware that you were like getting it. Your parents were aware it was on your report card, but it didn't actually affect your future.
Yeah, it was just a social thing that they used to enforce rules.
And so like these you could really tell the difference between how people responded to the system because there would be girls who had like stacks because they were pinned to each other, so in a stack, so the students who had the worst ones stacked up. And this wasn't every grade level. I believe this was my freshman year that this was going on, or it might have been my sophomore year. Every grade level didn't do this, but one specific grade level this was happening. And it was a teacher who taught class, so like those students could see it on their board. So they would stack, so they would just get thicker off the board, and you could see how people were doing. And they were these thin like sheets of paper.
Yeah.
You could tell the difference because certain girls got to the point where they were like, but it actually doesn't affect anything.
Yeah.
Like you didn't go to detention. You didn't have, it literally was just like you had a grade of, it was called your citizenship grade of how good of a student you were, but just good of a person, not like whatever.
Like, this is an all-girls school, so are we enforcing how good of a woman you are? Are
Yeah.
we enforcing like what are we
well,
enforcing
especially because
here?
when you really break it down, like you could get written up for like dress code,
Yeah,
written
exactly.
up for whatever.
So it's like,
yeah, it was just, but
okay.
I think about it because I bring it up because of the point system in Hogwarts, where you have not only this weird sort of arbitrary like points to these people, points from these people, but also like an arbitrary system of who's getting to acknowledge them, who's giving points, who's playing favorites.
And I don't want to give any merits to the author, but her name's J.K. Rowling. We all know who she is. I'm gonna say her name because, oh boy, as Dumbledore says, fear of the name increases fear of the name of the thing itself. But she has talked about how a lot of the book is a examination of the private school system, or excuse me, the public school system is what it's called in the UK, which means these private boarding schools, and how a lot of their pedagogy was harmful, both emotionally and educationally. And part of that is the point system, because that does work within English boarding schools. Is you're divided up into groups, houses, dorms, whatever you call it, and you do have points that are given and taken. And so she did copy that over into the Hogwarts system, but it's mostly just a plot point.
Yeah,
like when you read the books, it's just like it's just like like now they're gonna win the House Cup. Oh, great!
It's always just funny because at the end of every book, it doesn't matter what.
No, Gryffindor always wins.
It doesn't matter who did what.
Yeah.
They just sort of, and it's main character syndrome, I suppose. But I was fascinated by it because it was something that I think there's an interesting equation of sort of adding a point value to your humanity, so to speak, or your value as a human being. And how it's sort of at the end they were always like, well, Harry Potter saved the world, so Gryffindor wins the House Cup.
Sometimes though, it's because like in the first book, one thing that they do, and this I think is part of the nexus of why, especially given J.K. Rowling's hateful stances, beliefs, that why there's so much to be reckoned with in your relationship to Harry Potter as an adult is because the books are full of all this gray. And sometimes the gray is like positive gray, or positive like, oh, that does flip against what I was expecting to be here, whether how we write stories or what I would expect out of like a main character thing. Because for example, in the first book, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione they've gotten the Sorcerer's Stone and they've, defeated Voldemort for the first time, and Slytherin's going to win the House Cup. But then Dumbledore goes through and he's like awarding points for bravery for each thing that they've done. They're tied with Slytherin until he awards 10 points to Neville for standing up to your friends.
Yes.
And that's what like tips it over. And so sometimes these points are like just, oh, they lost 50 points and that's then going to mean that people have turned against Harry. And so like that then helps the plot. But also sometimes they are used to try to enforce like a morality of ways. But then at the battle at the end of the 7th book, they're blown up. And all those rubies and stuff are all over the floor and they're never reinstated again, because it's like the house system and the point system is part of what divided us, which then allowed for Voldemort to do what he did. And so we have
Interesting.
On an only wizarding level, when you get into house elves and centaurs, oh boy.
Yeah.
The metaphor falls down.
Falls right
and
apart.
It's real fucked.
Well, it's also interesting because I would say something that, like, when it comes to these systems, and I do like how sort of complicated the metaphor is, because it is obviously a metaphor for the human experience, which is not an uncomplicated experience, which is to say that one of the things that I thought was interesting about this sort of house system and what it did to kids growing up who were reading the books, which I didn't have that experience, but I did watch my friends have that experience, was this intense desire to identify with something that then put you in a group of other like-minded people. So it fits the same thing of sort of like high school, the stereotypes, the
Mm.
middle school stereotypes as well. But like you're a jock, you're a theater kid, you're
Mhm.
a math and science nerd. Like
Yeah, you're a
they
band kid.
yeah, and all of those groups then are against each other from the
Mhm.
sense of, well, you don't like us because we're not like you,
You
you're
don't
not
like
like
us.
us, and
Yeah,
now
yeah.
we have sort of these social barriers which seem to happen in all types of society. And then the thing that I think is interesting is for both of us, we then went to college
Mhm.
and sought out those same experiences in sort of the Greek system
Yes.
of attempting to be in you were in a sorority, I was in a
Mhm.
co-ed fraternity,
Mhm.
and we went to the same school, and that school is a school that doesn't have sort of like a traditional Greek system.
Yes.
And so I think what's interesting about it is like I was looking at it and reading Harry Potter having gone through that system
Mm.
of seeking out the ability to sort of put myself
Yeah,
in
yeah,
a
yeah.
box of people. And you've got sort of the outer layer of being a part of the Greek system, which is sort of an opt-in, which is the same as getting into Hogwarts, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because you've got the element of like people have to like me enough to give me a bid. I have to rush all these
Yeah,
different
yeah, yeah.
places. It's the application process, all of those things. And then inside the Greek system, you also have sort of like the idea of lines of bigs and littles
Mm.
and finding that and getting kind of put into the group that is based on your traits as a person.
Yeah.
And as negative as that can be, I think it can also be something, especially in times of your lives where things are not sort of clear or sort
Yes.
of easy and you're trying to figure out who you are. Being told you are like these other people is something that feels very warm, welcoming, and inviting.
Yeah. I also think, like, Greek system and also, like, sorting in Harry Potter, I identify as Gryffindor. Just, but one of the reasons why I think the house system appeals to people is when you're given the sword and hat, it's supposed to see things in you that maybe others don't see. And that like what you know to be true about yourself is finally validated on an outside system.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Harry is so scared to be sorted into Slytherin is because he's this chosen one and he has all this like he already knows at that point that people think he may have otherworldly qualities,
Mhm.
but he doesn't know what to do with them. He's 11.
Yeah.
He's only just been thrust into this world, but he knows based off what Ron has said, who's just immediately adopted him as his best friend, no questions asked, and is like, Slytherin's bad. And so Harry's like, cool, Slytherin's bad. I don't want to be in bad. I just want one thing that's I'm always going to be good. And that's what Gryffindor like appeals for him for. But I think personally, like one of the reasons why I resonated with being a Gryffindor is I'm the type of person that when shit goes down, I do something.
Mhm.
And I think when I was younger, people thought there was like a level of naivete or a level of like, you don't fully understand social things that maybe they would think that I would freeze
Mm.
in those situations. And so being like, no, no, I belong in Gryffindor. I'm an oldest. I know what to do. It gave
Yeah.
me agency and it also gave me like, I was very proud of the fact that I could handle big stuff.
Yeah.
That's its own coping mechanism, which the books later do explore,
Mhm.
because when you are a fighter in a fight or flight situation, you don't process till later.
Right.
That's how I work. But I think like going back to the Greek system and like finding, I think what you said is so true, especially like I joined a Greek organization my freshman year.
Mhm.
It was my second semester of my freshman year. And I loved college, but I loved that first semester of like finally getting to define myself on my own terms. I got to study acting all day long, which is all I ever wanted to do. And I was like trying all these different things and meeting all these different people. And I thrive when I'm like really like wanting to burst out into something. I thrive in that. But I was looking for like, okay, what's one thing that I can learn and grow in?
Mm.
And that's what my organization gave me
Mhm.
and gave me models of what that could look like as I got older. But then I had the experience, and this is where the Harry Potter books pick up a lot of like English boarding school culture. There's a lot of like intense rivalry
Mm.
between groups.
Sure.
And I didn't experience that in the Greek system at our college. I know friends in other Greek systems and other colleges that did.
Yeah.
So, easily transferable. But in like my friends who then would later come out for these bids, and we both were chosen by our selective organizations to be
Sure.
a part of this. And then I would have friends who weren't chosen.
Yes.
And then they'd be like, well, like, why wasn't I chosen for this thing?
Yeah.
And sometimes they would come out more than once. And sometimes they wouldn't be chosen more than once.
Yeah.
And sometimes I was like, I just think that this wouldn't be the place for you. Like, I honestly feel like this would negatively impact you. And then some of those meetings I wasn't in. Like, I was abroad or, like, other stuff was happening, so I was like, "I can't say anything." But, yeah, then it became, like, a reckoning of, "Oh, no. I have been chosen. You have not. How do I make sure that you know that that doesn't impact my friendship?"
Yeah, it's interesting because it's easy for us to say on the side of people who were accepted into the group to say, well, I don't think you would like it that much, or like it wouldn't be that special for you, or it wouldn't be the right fit. It's easy to say that when you're the one who's inside.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting because I think you and I pledged for, or the terminology has since been changed.
Yeah, I have no idea what it is.
I believe a lot of the terminology has changed through attempts to make things less
More
whatever.
equitable.
But
Yeah.
when we did it, we rushed and we pledged and we I'll use those terms because I think most people are aware of them, mostly because of the ABC television show Greek.
Or if you've ever done Greek life yourself.
Yes, or if you've been in Greek life. But we had opposite reasons for rushing, which I think is interesting because for me, I went to Emerson and I was like, we keep saying at college. I've named the college on this podcast a number of times.
Great.
I got to Emerson and I was absolutely miserable for the first time in my life. I had never felt so alone and so outside and so like I didn't fit in. Which is, I think, largely the opposite experience of what people think or talk about with at Emerson. But for me, I had come from a place where I had friends that I liked. I felt like I had found my sort of group of people. I was very overworked as a kid. As we spoke, we both went to kind of college prep intense schools, but I had carved out my niche. I played sports, I danced, I had friends, I kind of knew what I was doing. I was not by myself all the time.
Yeah.
At Emerson, I got there and I went through the whole freshman year and I just all the time felt so alone. And I remember getting to Emerson and it is like when you move in, it is such a loud and overwhelming experience.
It is.
And I said, I think I may have made a grave mistake when we moved in.
Baby.
Because I was just like, I'm just not, there's no way I'm going to fit in here. I am not the type of kid who is singing musicals down the hall.
Yeah.
I am not, at that point, was very much not a performer. I was very much like, I've since grown into myself and done quite a bit of comedy and those types of things. And obviously I kind of talk for a living now, but that at the time was not something I was interested in. I came to school to be a writer and I wanted to kind of write, and that's what I wanted to do. And finding my place at school was very difficult, and I sort of kept feeling like, okay, well, I'm gonna figure it out. Like, there's no way I'll get through an entire year of college and not find my place. And I had made one really good friend, and she also felt the same way. And I think then so I rushed my second semester of sophomore year because my first semester of sophomore year, I was kind of trying to figure it out. And then my one good friend who I had made, who I'm still very close with to this day, transferred. She was like, I can't be here.
Oh my goodness.
I also would go home. I would literally I was just like, I just can't be here. I would go to New York. I would visit my friend who was going to school there from high school. And I think I was trying pretty hard, whatever. But it got to this point where I was like, I can't believe I've gone somewhere where we should all sort of be into the same thing. I'm in a pretty specific major. And I don't know anybody that likes what I like or that feels like I want to hang out with or go to parties with or do these things. And so that was when I finally was like, and to speak to how media can influence you, I was like, I loved Greek growing up. I literally loved Greek growing up.
I love that.
And I was like, I know I don't want to be in a sorority. I've done the all girls thing. That's not what I'm missing, but I really miss having a group of friends that like me, which sounds so depressing.
No. I don't think I think if you've been listening, like my intense emotional reaction, I had a lot of that in high school.
Yeah.
You know? And so like I deeply relate to everything you're saying because I just had that 4 years earlier.
Yeah. And I think it was a weird experience for me because I think most people get it out of their system in high school. Like that is where it happens. And then college is supposed to be the place where you sort of expand your horizons. There are more people, there are more things to do.
Yeah.
And I do remember when I was in high school feeling like, okay, well, like I have this small group of friends who gets me, but when I get to college, everybody's going to be so cool. And then I got to college and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I think that was like the other big thing.
Yeah.
And then when I did rush, I was like, I'm just going to do it. And I loved Greek and I was like, my dream experience right now is to be in Kappa Tau. That was always like the one that I loved. I was obsessed with Kappa. I was obsessed with just sort of like the chaotic energy of it, whatever. So when I did rush Kappa. So I rushed the organization you were part of, and I rushed Zeta, and I rushed them both at the same time. And I went to 2 events for Kappa. When I went to Zeta, and the first meeting that I went to, I like had this experience where I was like, these are the people that I want to be a part, like I want to be around. So and then but then it was like the experience of like, well, are they gonna want to be around me? And you have that horrible experience.
I was fully convinced I wasn't gonna get in because the semester that we pledged, it was like 100+ people who came out
so
for
many
Kappa.
people went out,
and I was like, I am a second semester freshman. There's no way I'm getting in.
I think the thing about it, and the reason I wanted to bring it up in relation to this house system and the sorting hat, is that I think back to it, and I do think if I had not gotten in that semester, which was the first semester I had rushed, I don't know that I would have stayed at Emerson. And I know it sounds sort of like it's like hokey to be like, oh, like my fraternity is like the thing that made my college experience.
No, it's not hokey at all.
But it really is. It is, and I think it was more about it was more about looking at a group of people, which is sort of the experience we're talking about with Harry in the first book and the sorting hat, was looking at a group of people and saying, out of all of the options of groups that I would like to be accepted into, this is the one that speaks to exactly what I'm looking for. And I remember on the night that bids were supposed to come out, just the intense anxiety of just like, I just want them to also see what I see in them, see that in me, and to then get the yes, sort of, so to speak, is the same thing that I think about when it comes to that moment you have in the first book and the first movie, whichever you're looking at, where Harry is sort of sitting with the sorting hat on and whispering, not Slytherin, not Slytherin.
Not Slytherin,
And he doesn't know anything because he hasn't been here yet. All he knows is that Gryffindor has these qualities that at 11, obviously it's a little bit different than when you're 19 and kind of starting your life. But like, so I think you're sitting there and you're sort of like, you are just desperate to be told that you have some qualities that you've looked at as good qualities. And I don't have the same experience of being like, not those people, but these people.
And that's also like a very English, very classist, rooted within the house system, because like these public read private in American understanding. Boarding schools were the way that the upper class maintained control over being in the upper class. And so like pitting the two houses was another way of like, you have thousands of years of interfamilial rivalry because it's a monarchy in the United Kingdom. And so their class system is based on feudalism.
What's also
So
interesting to talk about the class side of things, which I think is interesting because not knowing this, but reading the books as an adult, but also previously even like experiencing them, because I was aware of like the first 3 books as a teenager and everything like that while everyone was sort of going through their Harry Potter craze. I just didn't get into them. Was the fact that I do remember one of my biggest gripes is that I hate the main characters. I was so bored by them and so irritated by them all the time.
That's where fandom comes in.
Yes.
See, that's the thing, is like the movie characters exist entirely differently than the book characters for me. And they're very different people to me. And like, and my biggest gripe with, I don't rewatch the films. I'm not like a fan who's really comforted by them because I'm like, you missed it. And from the 4th movie on, Ron and Hermione are totally separate characters.
Well, the books themselves, I think I suppose perhaps if I were there, I certainly wouldn't be a Gryffindor. It was something about it that like I found them to be sort of the energy of even at 11, because they're being brought into this sort of system where they're being told what's right, what's wrong, and who to like and who to hate. They have this very big energy of looking down their nose at people. And I think what's interesting is the reveal of what Slytherin was when it started and how Voldemort sort of becomes the villain that he becomes, is that Voldemort, who was Tom Riddle
Mhm.
previously, does not come from the privileged background that the other characters do.
No, his ancestors do.
Exactly. But his actual, like, upbringing and going to Hogwarts, he
Mhm.
is sort of on the lower level
Yeah.
of the class system. And in terms of socioeconomic status and everything like that, I think one of the things that I thought was interesting about the Slytherin household was that they were they were 11 and being told they were evil. Like,
Yeah, and that's, like, one thing that, like, that the books actually address in the 7th one
mm,
is, like, the house got that reputation off of Voldemort,
right.
and then it became a chicken or an egg.
Yeah.
Are you going to be evil because you're placed in Slytherin, or are you evil already?
Yeah.
But also the thing is, like, Slytherin is made up of people who are from pure blood backgrounds
Mhm.
because that's who Salazar Slytherin said should receive magical whatever, but also they're cunning.
Mhm.
And cunning and ambition live side by side, and Gryffindors are ambitious.
Yeah.
So it's basically like two sides of the same coin. And as the books progress, they're like, okay, so there's really not that much difference between these two.
Yeah.
It's just like one has been cast as the bad guy based off of their familial lineage.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because it becomes especially because of how young these characters are
Yes.
put into it. Like, when you
Yes.
look at a Draco and you then learn that his upbringing is more of an abusive one, and you sort of come through
Yeah,
that situation.
his parenting model is really interesting, I
Yeah.
think, because, like, he's a child who received a lot of love, but he's not a child who received a lot of guidance about what he should be beyond what his family has always done. And I think, like, one reason why he's such a compelling character is you're witnessing him go from, like, "I'm just gonna do everything that my family has said is right," to then, like, being faced with, "Oh, shit, like, this is gonna kill me." And he doesn't make the decision to not do it because he thinks it's wrong. He's coming into realizing it is wrong.
Mhm.
But he makes the decision because he realizes it's dumb, like, that it's just all futile.
Yeah.
And, like, he doesn't have the heart to kill Dumbledore because he knows that murder's wrong.
Mm.
And one of the really fascinating points is, like, he's so beloved by his parents that they go literally to the ends of the magical earth to protect him, and Harry doesn't have that. There are
Mm.
some characters who do not have a family that loves them in that way, but his parents are aligned with a really hateful message. And, like, the disconnect between, like, he sent these presents, like, all the time. Like, he sent, like, his parents write him every day. He sent these big gift baskets. You know, he hoards that over other people,
Sure.
hoards that over other children. He is a big bully. But it's interesting because I think, like, characterizing his childhood as abusive is missing the point of why he got to where he got to where
That's
he
interesting. Yeah.
is he got there because of the messages that were given him that are abusive in nature because they're hateful.
Mm.
Understanding the way that Draco got to where he got to is a failing of a system of the school, of his parents, of the ideology itself,
Yeah.
because he does some really fucked up shit.
Well, what's interesting though is I wonder, one of the things that you mentioned is that he's giving a lot of gifts and that he sent a lot of gifts. He sent a lot of letters and all these different things. And his first instinct is to hold them over other people, which to me, reading that makes me feel that I don't know that the gifts are necessarily acts of love so much as they are in the same way we see the Dursleys give they
Dudley.
give Dudley so many gifts. They are implications of status. They're
I think you're
and
exactly
so
right.
I almost hesitate to call that love from his parents,
Yeah.
as I view it as more almost in some ways, a reinforcement of the idea that you are above other
Yes.
people.
I think you're right. I think you're right. That's exactly what it is. But I think, like, two children
Mm.
who are his same age and seeing him receive those,
Mhm.
they could be viewed as love.
Sure, but I think that might be something that's even more isolating as a child.
Yep.
For people to believe that your parents, especially when you're sort of the hero of the story that you're in, is an orphan. And I always find it interesting when we talk about sort of comparative suffering. And
Mm.
from Harry's point of view, you look at Draco and you say, you have both parents who love you, who send you all these things. They've been with you your whole life. You've never had anything horrible happen to you. And
Mhm.
on Draco's side of things, you look at it and say, you don't have parents, but that's because they loved you so much that they were willing to die to leave a system that that my parents are still
Yeah.
entranced in. And so I think you can look at it from both sides and see these two characters who are pitted against each other by status, by ideology in this unfair world, by households, by the different, like, the Slytherin versus Gryffindor rivalry. And you can go from the very intense levels of that and also just the very arbitrary levels of Quidditch, where they're playing in the same role and trying to move forward. You can look at that and you can have both of those characters look at each other and say, how can you be so selfish? You have exactly what I want.
Yeah, I think that's A, why they're really good foils of each other. And then B, when Harry's characteristic changes, and this is where I get very emotional as an educator, because Harry is trained to be a child soldier. By the time this boy is 17, he's like, I have to go fight to save everyone else on my own, because this is my destiny, because this is what my figures of my life who have raised me have told me I need to do, i.e. Dumbledore. He's a child.
I'm so glad that you brought this up, because something that I am surprised I don't see more discussed in the discourse around Harry Potter in terms of the text is the fact that, to me, Dumbledore is a massive villain.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and
100%.
I'm fascinated because he's this beloved character that everyone seems to be very happy with.
Fandom has
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm not obviously as into fandom as I am in other places.
I came to this realization about Dumbledore in a couple of ways. One, reading fan fiction, but actually really encouraging the two podcasts, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text and Witch Please, which talks about different factors of the Harry Potter world through different academic studies. So like the study of the Orient in result to this like glorification of the East in the first book, or looking at the house elves as a metaphor for racism, or slavery more specifically, which is a whole thing. So I came to really this Dumbledore discourse through reading different like fan fictions, but mostly through these podcasts and also becoming an educator myself, because Dumbledore's a collector. He collects people who will serve the common good of defeating Voldemort, and he turns them into pawns.
When you do find out about Voldemort's background, to some degree, I would blame Dumbledore for some of the creation of that villain. And
he blames himself.
Yeah, but I don't think he blames himself in a way that's like helpful.
No,
like
it's
where
not.
he acknowledges it in enough of a way, because I think you still get this idea that Voldemort and Tom Riddle previously were this inherently evil person that couldn't have been saved.
Yep.
And I just don't know that kids are ever. Like I just don't believe that there's a child at 11 that has gotten to the point of not ever being able to be saved.
Yep.
I think there are children at 11 who adults are not willing to put the work in to help.
100%.
And I think what's frustrating for me, just from the text standpoint, is that because it's told from Harry Potter's perspective, who idolizes Dumbledore in such a way, you never get that moment where someone says, like, actually, I don't think not only could you have saved this kid, maybe if you had tried a little bit harder, and maybe you couldn't have, maybe you didn't have the skills to do so or whatever. You'll never know because it's not the twist that we went through.
Yeah.
But arguably, you didn't try hard enough, I would make the argument.
I completely agree.
And then additionally, you've upheld a system that created that.
Yep.
First of all, you didn't dismantle the system after you said this child went through the system and became a horrible, terrible terrorist. And you didn't say, maybe we should look at what we did.
You should just like investigate this a little bit and be like, how did we fail this child so much?
Not at all.
You're the adult in the room. Come on, guys.
But then on top of that, to solve the problem that you've now created, you picked another group of 11-year-olds to then force to save the world every book. And I think the thing that really upset me is
the third one. Third one, they get the adults get to do it. They just get to ride on a hippogriff.
Right, true. But every time I read I've gone through it, and I was getting through each book, I was like, oh, I wish these kids would ask adults for help. There are so many around.
Yes. Well, and this is the really interesting thing that like come back to the educator thing, is that Harry was abused for the first 10 years of his life.
Yes.
He does not trust a single adult.
Well, but then I would say, though, he does ask for help. And he gets a riddle in response.
Yep.
Like
and this is my problem with Dumbledore, because oh my God. Okay, so Dumbledore, for me, he is a collector of those who will serve the overall message, and he collects those who are on the margins because he feels he's on the margins himself.
Okay.
So, and every single one of those people dies. First thing is you have Lupin, who he is a part of this whole, like Dumbledore, since he was like little, was like, I'm going to make this a school that is accessible to a child who is a werewolf. And I know other parents are against this, but I'm going to make this happen. So he plants a tree and then is like, okay, cool. This is why the Whopping Willow is here, so that no one will come into this room when you're having this transformation. There's no like, what if we just give you wolfsbane? And they're like, oh, wait, that's invented later. Okay. There's no adult that camps out with his child as he's having this incredibly traumatic experience, so his friends learn how to transform to then keep him company. Okay, cool. Nice. But because he gives that to Lupin then, is very loyal to Dumbledore. And then the werewolves can't have jobs. So then he offers this job to Lupin, but he doesn't do anything when Lupin is, expelled for being revealed. He walks him to the gate, but he doesn't be like, I'm the headmaster. He can stay. He just is like, okay, cool. You go do your thing. This position's cursed. And then he sends Lupin deeper and deeper into the werewolf territory, increasing Lupin's own self-hatred. But it's because it's gathering information for the larger thing.
Yeah.
He tries to collect Sirius. Sirius is from this long line of pureblood wizards, and he was raised under the same hateful ideology that Draco was, and he bucked it. He started to buck it very early. He's placed in Gryffindor. He's basically adopted by the Potters, Harry's grandparents, who adore him, and Dumbledore sees that he has all these tools to be able to offer the movement, but Sirius says no. Sirius doesn't place a blind face in Dumbledore because he doesn't trust authority overall because of his parents. So when he's wrongfully accused and put into Azkaban, Dumbledore doesn't do a goddamn thing because he can't help advance taking down Voldemort at that moment in time. And Harry is his ultimate collectible, which Snape pushes back against. Because, as Snape says, have you raised this child for slaughter? Has that been my entire job? I thought I was doing this because I was in love with his mother. And this was my way of paying back how I pushed her away and literally am the cause of her death.
Yeah.
And Dumbledore's like, this is the only way the world is saved.
And I think what's interesting about that too is that Snape is the one who's cast as the villain throughout the book, or as this sort of dark force, and consistently is sort of blamed as potentially the problem. I believe in
through the whole thing.
Yeah, through the whole thing.
He's often the one that they think is
they think
up to no good.
Yeah, and then you slowly find out that he's actually trying to protect Harry throughout the entire situation. Motivations for that being what they are.
We can talk about the sexism. We can talk about the sexism of that till Kingdom Come.
However, I think what's interesting is that you sort of end up with this character in Dumbledore who is, I think, a general first, someone who believes he is fighting a war.
Yes.
And to put him in a position where he is the one sort of guiding children throughout this is the wrong position for him to be in, first of all. But also, I think one of the things that was surprising to me that Harry never connects, and perhaps you don't connect this because you're 11, but even unless I'm forgetting something in the later books, he doesn't ever really connect this, which is that instead of taking Harry to any of the people who he now finds later in life could have taken care of him and would have been happy to take care of him, Dumbledore chooses to put Harry in a place where he knows he will not be treated well.
Yes.
And in some regards, they say it was for his own protection, all these different things. They would never have looked for him there, blah, blah, blah.
But a whole blood magic thing, which is
part of it. But I also
the main reason why he's placed there.
I also have to imagine that there was another solution.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
And part of me looking at it and analyzing it in the way that it read to me is that part of what was necessary for Harry to be sort of guided into the position that he's guided into, where he is willing to sacrifice himself, is that he had to be in such a bad position before he's brought to Hogwarts that he is vulnerable enough to accept any kind of love, whether that love is proper or whether it is manipulative.
Oh, 100%. Because Dumbledore seeks out those who are marginalized or have already been marginalized because he knows they will follow him to the end of the earth because he shows up.
Yeah.
The reason why they say that Harry is placed at the Dursleys is because Petunia is his mother's sister, and as long as he's within that house, the blood protection that his mother gave when she died won't be over him. And so nothing could have happened to him from 0 to 10. One, it enforces the notion that the only family who can really love and protect you has to be blood. And two, it enforces the notion that the only way to solve these larger problems is with a savior who has been suffered greatly to then understand the meaning of goodness in the world because they weren't given it as a child. And then they're like, I must protect goodness. And they come in and they do this. Note, this is only boys.
Mm.
Because, and this is the part that, like, as an adult and reading Harry Potter, I've really reckoned with, is like how the boys of Harry Potter, as they're becoming young men, are trained to be soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And how by the time we get to this 7th book, Harry is willing to risk all bodily kinds of harm because he's stopped thinking about his body as something that he needs to protect and started thinking about it as something he will lay down for someone else.
Mm.
He's 17.
Yeah.
And he has to come to that realization. So he will sacrifice himself at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So part of me is like, is one of the reasons why they didn't interfere in the Triwizard Tournament when he's in all these really deadly confrontations is Dumbledore's like, well, he's going to have to learn how to defeat Voldemort. Why did he do it here?
Oh, yeah. I very much thought the
Like,
Triwizard tournament and the things that happened to him were intentional.
yeah.
And in a way of intending to sort of, when you go through the whole thing and then you sort of find out that ultimately they know, or Dumbledore knows that in the end he's going to have to sacrifice himself to save the world, you then realize that all of the moments where I personally was shouting, please, please, dear God, call an adult, you then sort of come to understand that I think those challenges were put forth intentionally to sort of create this lack of understanding of danger and death.
Yes. And I think that's something that we enforce within boys,
Mm.
and or at least this very gendered world enforces within boys, because there are multiple times where Ginny, first and foremost, who lived through an extremely traumatic thing at a young age, is the only other living survivor of being possessed by Voldemort
Mhm.
other than Harry.
Mm.
She has tremendous amount of magical power, and she often is like, we don't have to do it this way.
Yeah.
She's like, why? Like literally why?
Yeah.
Like there's no reason for us to do it in this bodily harming way. Or Hermione, who's like, guys, like what if we just didn't? Like what if there was another way around this? But one of the ways that the valor of all of the Weasley boys is shown is how they like immediately stand up to do things.
Mhm.
And then Neville coming into, he came from something that was marginal, is more of a marginalized identity. His parents were lost in a horrific way. He was teased all the time because he's a child of trauma. So his magic showed up later.
Mhm.
And then he comes into this, his own. None of the teachers defended him when he was younger. They could have fostered this. They didn't. And because he maintains more of this marginalized identity, he doesn't fully lean into this like male savior complex thing
Mhm.
that happens, but he still has an element of it. He
Yeah.
literally wields a sword at the end and kills a monster.
Sure,
Like, he's like a knight.
that's sort of also like you mentioned, the standing up to his friends. It's very clearly his trajectory of becoming valuable is coming willing to take physical risk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And like as a child, I really related to the adrenaline of getting into an adventure. Like I loved adventure and fantasy was my genre because it was a physicalization of the intensity of my imagination. And just sort of like tracing back to Harry as child soldier, the only way he got there is he had to be failed systematically over the course of the time by those who are teaching him. Because you have Molly and you have Arthur who regularly are like, he's a child.
Yes.
And you have Sirius who's like, he's a child. But then Sirius is taken from him and Dumbledore bears the brunt of the guilt of that. But at the same time, it works out because then the next adult that he will really be under the sway of is Dumbledore. And I don't think Dumbledore does a lot of this intentionally. I think one of the reasons why he's so insidious is because he ends up collecting because he doesn't know how to form family in any other way. And so he needs these people as much as they need him. Like Slughorn collects students for his own gain, but at the end of the day, it's actually shown to be pretty harmless.
Yeah.
And actually, when pressed, will do the right thing, which is their way of being like, Slytherin isn't all that bad. We're going to introduce this in the 6th book. Haha, novel feeling. But then Dumbledore is the insidious collector because he needs the collection himself.
Interesting. I am intrigued by the idea that you don't think it's intentional. Do you think?
I think it's intentional sometimes.
Do you think that your perhaps perception of it is maybe warped by some of your nostalgia for the property, having read it when you were younger and relating to Harry? and wanting, because I do think it's written in a way that, because you are sort of coming from the perspective of Harry, there is a love for Dumbledore. The seventh book
Yeah.
is very much the final moments that you have in that book with Dumbledore and Harry, and the speeches that kind of go through there that are very well written at the time. I think it also, having only read them as an adult,
Yeah.
I found a negative connotation from Dumbledore from the beginning for me. And I
Yeah.
think there was a level of sort of being so angry that this character as an adult was failing a child
Mm.
in a way that, because the stakes at the beginning are so low, that it felt like it had to have been intentionally failing. I think it really got to that point during the fourth book with the Triwizard Tournament, where I was like sitting there and thinking it would be so easy to stop this.
Yeah.
And knowing that, perhaps just because I was an adult when I read it, knowing that he could have stopped it and
yeah.
chose not to, then sort of felt like this character was and I again don't know that this was intentional, but I do wonder how much of the idea that Dumbledore is not a calculating person comes from having an attachment when you're younger.
Well, I think he's very much calculating
Yeah.
person. There's never a part of me that doesn't think he's not calculating, because he also talks about it.
Mhm.
Like, he owns up, like, why he can never be Minister of Magic is because power is too seductive for him.
Mm.
So the character itself is self-aware of the fact that he's calculating, but I think it's a really accurate portrayal of people who are that calculating and who are that manipulative, because they don't even know they're manipulating sometimes. Like, he's so insidious in thinking that he's doing the right thing
Yeah.
that he has no self-awareness that he's harming others.
It's just so it's interesting 'cause it's
Sometimes.
yeah, no, it's interesting because
Sometimes.
I think, like,
About
to
Harry
me,
specifically sometimes.
I guess what's interesting about it to me, though,
Yeah.
is that I think what perhaps worries me about those books, and how much of a large portion they had for kids at such a young age reading it, is that as a kid, you're not reading it and thinking, oh, Dumbledore is manipulating this character. You're reading it from Harry's perspective and thinking, oh, Dumbledore is a good person, a good role model. This is the type of person I need in my life.
Yeah.
And I think it is a character who is, especially as you get further on and you look back, manipulating this poor child from the very beginning. And
Yeah.
the kids sort of reading it aren't reading it that way. They're reading it as it's being presented to them as someone who is a good person in your life.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that I don't know that there's a resolution to that point necessarily.
There isn't. And I think there's some things that Dumbledore does that are quite honorable, and there are some things and people who he fights for that are quite honorable. However, he's the type of character that if you walked in and we were in a staff meeting at some school, I would have to hesitate before I slapped him.
He's the type of character that I would be like calling the police on. I'm going to be honest with you.
I think that's literally, so, like, I would join you.
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, cool. We're going to do a write-up and we're going to call the police because this man should not be around children in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Because of the way that and also the thing is that he does it to adults too.
Yes. Yeah.
He does it, and that's the thing, is like, he doesn't know any other way to interact with human beings. Because we see it do it to his siblings.
Right.
And Albaforth, his sibling, calls him out on it. And their confrontation is what kills their sister.
You know what I'm curious about, and this is perhaps just more of a moral question than anything, is I do wonder, the book presents these ideas of, or the books, all 7 of them, present this idea of good versus evil.
Yeah.
And the sort of black and white idea of being on this right side of history, of who's good and who's evil and who should be taken down, and this idea of fear of a specific type of evil, and to the point that you're not willing to even say this person's name.
Yeah.
And what I think we've sort of walked ourselves to is the idea that perhaps on both sides there was good and evil in those characters.
Oh, yeah.
And I am curious, in your opinion, which type of evil is more detrimental? As you can tell, taking on a 7-book series in 1 hour may have been a bit of a feat, especially one that has so much of a cultural conversation that needs to be had around it. We'll be back next week with the second half of my conversation with Mary Frances, in which we'll discuss a lot more about how she's navigating her relationship with Harry Potter in the wake of her feelings regarding the creator. Tune in next week for the rest of that conversation and a bit more about that discussion. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.